Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The hospital room was tense, almost unbearably so, the quiet punctuated only by the soft hum of medical monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses' feet outside the door. Bill Spencer paced back and forth like a caged lion, his eyes dark with a mix of fear, fury, and disbelief. For weeks he had sensed that something was wrong with his son, Liam, something beyond the normal complications that followed surgery. But what he had just uncovered now, sitting in that sterile hospital room surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the low beeping of the 4 monitors, was beyond anything he could have imagined. Grace, the woman he had reluctantly trusted, the one who had insinuated herself into their lives with her calm demeanor and careful words, was poisoning his son. The thought hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making him stumble slightly as he gripped the edge of Liam's hospital bed for support. Every loving memory he had of Liam as a child, every quiet conversation, every laugh shared with his son, surged through him now, tainted by the realization that someone had been deliberately putting him in harm's way. He could hardly believe it, yet the evidence was irrefutable. The charts, the lab reports, the sudden, inexplicable setbacks in Liam's recovery, all pointed in one terrifying direction. Grace had not just made a mistake, she had acted with intention. Bill's mind raced as he thought about the consequences. Liam, his boy, his flesh and blood, had been vulnerable, lying there day after day, dependent on the medical staff, while someone he trusted was systematically weakening him, endangering his life. The anger bubbling inside him was almost overwhelming, mingling with a crushing sense of guilt. Why hadn't he seen it sooner? Why had he allowed Grace anywhere near Liam, let alone in a position where she could do him harm? The question gnawed at him relentlessly, a mental assault that made his fists clench and his jaw tighten until it ached. As he stood there, barely noticing the stifling hospital air, Bill's thoughts drifted back to the moments when he had defended Grace, had vouched for her in front of Liam, had even smiled politely when she had inserted herself into family discussions and bedside vigils. How blind he had been. And yet, beneath the anger, a cold, strategic part of Bill began to emerge, the part that had built an empire from nothing, the part that knew how to respond when someone crossed a line too far. This was no ordinary betrayal. This was an attempt on his son's life, and the person responsible would pay dearly. He could feel the wheels turning in his mind, calculating, planning, even as his chest burned with a mix of fear and rage. He turned abruptly toward the door as the nurse entered, her clipboard clutched to her chest, sensing his agitation. "Mr. Spencer, are you all right?" she asked, her voice careful, tentative. Bill's eyes blazed at her for a moment before he spoke, his voice low but sharp. "No, I'm not all right. Because the person we trusted, the person we let in, is poisoning my son. Do you understand? My son." The nurse's expression went from concern to shock as Bill's words sank in, and he didn't wait for her response. He needed to confront Grace. He needed to see the woman face to face, to watch the truth on her face as it crumbled under the weight of exposure. Every second he wasted pacing, thinking, strategizing was a second closer to facing her. Grace herself was in the room down the hall, feigning concern, practicing her perfect sympathetic smile as she checked on Liam's chart, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be unaware, of the storm that was about to hit her. Bill's approach was silent, methodical, like a predator closing in on its prey. He entered the room without knocking, the door swinging wide and loud, drawing Grace's attention instantly. She looked up, startled, her carefully cultivated mask faltering for a split second, just enough for Bill to see the flicker of guilt, the panic, the calculation behind her eyes. "Bill, what are you?" she began, but he cut her off with a voice that was all sharp edges and fire. Don't you dare lie to me. I know what you've been doing. I know you've been poisoning my son." Grace froze, her hands gripping the edge of Liam's bed as if for support, but it was too late. Bill's gaze was like a spotlight, dissecting every micro-expression, every faltering word, every hesitation that betrayed her. "You trusted me," he said, voice trembling with fury. "You trusted me to look after Liam. And what did you do? You put him in danger deliberately. Do you have any idea what that means? Any idea what it feels like to know that the person you allowed in his life Hell, the person you allowed to be near him is actively trying to hurt him. Grace's lips parted, and for a moment she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had been confident, calculating, believing she could manipulate everyone around her. But she had underestimated Bill's instinct to protect his son. It's not what you think, she whispered, her voice shaky, the carefully constructed calm she always projected beginning to crumble. Bill's laugh, short and bitter, filled the room. Not what I think. Grace, the reports, the lab results, the sudden complications, what is that, if not exactly what I think? He moved closer, his presence looming over her like a storm, and Grace recoiled slightly, instinctively stepping back. But Bill didn't relent. He needed her to feel the weight of her actions, the full magnitude of what she had done. Liam is in that bed because of your betrayal. You're lucky he's strong enough to fight back. Lucky the doctors here were able to keep him stable despite your meddling. But make no mistake, Bill said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. If anything happens to him, if one hair on his head is harmed because of you, there will be consequences. And I will make sure you pay. You understand me? Grace's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for some kind of lifeline, but there was none. The truth was laid bare in front of her, in the harsh hospital light, in the fury radiating from the man who had loved and protected Liam his whole life. Bill continued, pacing now, his mind spinning with the possibilities. He would need to alert the hospital administration, ensure Liam's safety immediately, and he would need proof, hard, undeniable proof, of Grace's actions. But most importantly, he needed to confront the man or woman who had put their trust in Grace, who had vouched for her, and make them understand the gravity of this situation. Meanwhile, Liam lay in the hospital bed, unconscious, the 4 lines snaking into his arms, the monitors beeping steadily, oblivious to the drama unfolding just steps away. Bill's gaze softened briefly as he looked at his son, feeling a pang of both sorrow and fierce determination. He would protect Liam at all costs, and Grace, no matter what her motives, would no longer be a threat. He turned back to her, his eyes narrowing. You think you can manipulate me, Grace? You think you can manipulate my family? But you're done. Your schemes end here. And make no mistake, everyone will know exactly who you are, and what you've done. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Grace, finally sensing the inevitability of exposure, sagged against the bed, her composure shattered. Bill's fury had not yet abated, and the hospital room seemed to shrink under the intensity of his gaze. Nurses and doctors passing the hallway glanced in, sensing the tension, but none dared enter. Bill didn't care about appearances or decorum anymore. This was about his son, his family, and the betrayal that had pierced straight to his heart. And in that moment, a cold, unyielding clarity settled over him. Grace would answer for what she had done. He would ensure Liam's safety, even if it meant bringing down everyone Grace had manipulated along the way. He would protect his family, his empire, and his son, and he would do it without hesitation, without mercy, because some betrayals weren't just personal, they were dangerous, life-threatening, and unforgivable. As he stepped closer, ready to take the next step in confronting Grace fully, a plan began to form in his mind. He would expose her to everyone she had fooled, dismantle every lie she had told, and ensure she could never ever harm Liam or anyone else again. The fury, the grief, and the fear all intertwined in Bill's chest, but underneath it all there was something stronger. A fierce, unbreakable resolve. Liam's life, his health, and his future were worth any battle, any confrontation, any risk. And Grace, once a trusted figure in their lives, was about to learn exactly what happens when you betray the Spencer family. Bill's voice dropped to a final, cold, resonant whisper as he leaned closer to her. This ends now. Every lie, every scheme, every dangerous move you made, done. And you will pay. Understand? Grace could only nod, her confidence shattered, her power stripped away in the glare of a father's unrelenting love for his son. Outside, the hospital continued its quiet hum, but inside that room a reckoning had begun, and nothing, and no one would be the same again. Bill's words seemed to hang in the air, a tangible force that pressed down on Grace, robbing her of any sense of control. For a moment, she stared at him in stunned silence, the harsh fluorescent light reflecting off her wide eyes, revealing a mixture of fear, defiance, and a flicker of desperation. Bill noticed it all, The way her hands trembled slightly, the slight flush creeping across her cheeks, the tightening of her lips as if she were trying to contain a confession. And for Bill, that was confirmation enough. She knew she had been caught, and the facade she had so meticulously maintained was crumbling fast. He took a deep, steadying breath, forcing himself to focus not on the betrayal, not on the anger still boiling inside him, but on the next steps that would secure Liam's safety immediately and begin the unraveling of Grace's deceit before it could harm anyone else. The first step, he knew, was to ensure that she could not continue to have access to Liam. He would alert the hospital administration, involve the doctors and nurses directly responsible for his son's care, and make it absolutely clear that Grace was no longer trusted in any capacity. No excuses, no reasoning. Just facts, evidence, and the unrelenting force of a father protecting his child. As he began pacing again, thinking through the logistics, Grace's voice finally broke the tense silence, quivering but attempting to maintain authority. "Bill, you don't understand. I was trying to help." "I wasn't." Her words faltered, her eyes darting around as if searching for some way out, some justification that would turn the tables. But Bill was done listening to explanations. Every word she had spoken before had been carefully crafted, manipulative, designed to lull him into a false sense of trust, and now it was time for reality to land like a hammer. "Trying to help?" he spat, his tone laced with incredulity. "You call poisoning my son trying to help? You've endangered his life. You've put him in harm's way deliberately, and you expect me to believe that was some kind of noble act?" His voice rose slightly, carrying the raw, visceral edge of a father's fear turning into rage. He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could feel the intensity radiating off him, the palpable energy of a man whose love for his child was absolute and non-negotiable. The moment stretched on, heavy with tension, until finally Grace slumped in the chair beside Liam's bed, her defenses finally giving way. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a split second, she looked almost pitiable, human, as if the weight of her actions had finally settled on her shoulders. But Bill wasn't moved by pity. He couldn't afford to be. "I don't want your tears," he said, his voice low, controlled but cutting. "I don't want excuses. I want you out of here, and I want every doctor, nurse, and administrator in this hospital to know exactly what you've done. Do you hear me? This stops now." Grace nodded weakly, still trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but it was clear to Bill that her power was gone. He could almost see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed identity, the realization dawning on her that she had underestimated the Spencer resolve, the lengths a father would go to protect his child. And as he looked down at Liam, lying pale and fragile in the hospital bed, Bill's resolve hardened into something even more formidable than anger, a calculated determination. He would ensure that Liam received the best possible care, that every precaution was taken to restore his strength, and that Grace faced the consequences of her actions in full. But beyond that, he knew there would be fallout, legal consequences, familial consequences, and the unshakable knowledge that someone he had once trusted had tried to harm his family. As he contacted the hospital administration, his mind raced through the details he needed to provide. The unusual medication dosages, the inexplicable setbacks in Liam's recovery, the lab reports showing anomalies that could not be ignored. He spoke with precision, leaving no room for doubt, no room for Grace to wiggle free. Each word was deliberate, each fact presented in a way that would leave no question as to her culpability. And while he spoke, he kept an eye on Grace, watching the subtle shifts in her posture, the nervous glances, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of the blanket covering Liam. Every movement, every reaction confirmed his suspicion. She was guilty, and she knew it. After the administration had been alerted and security measures put in place to ensure Grace could no longer access Liam, Bill turned his attention back to his son. The monitors beeped steadily, but every readout, every line on the screen, was a reminder of how fragile Liam's condition had become under Grace's interference. Bill felt a surge of guilt, a painful self-recrimination that he had allowed her near his family, that he had ever trusted her. But beneath the guilt, there was also a fierce protective instinct, a resolve that burned brighter than ever. He would be Liam's guardian now in every sense. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, and strategically. Every doctor, nurse and administrator would understand that he would not tolerate any further threats to his son. As the hours passed, Bill stayed by Liam's side, monitoring his condition, speaking quietly to the medical staff, and making mental notes of the steps needed to secure his son's full recovery. Grace remained in the room under supervision, her demeanor now subdued, almost sullen, as the reality of her actions began to sink in. She attempted a few times to speak to Liam, to offer explanations or apologies, but Bill's presence was a constant barrier, a reminder that she had no access, no control, and no power over the outcome of her schemes. Bill's focus never wavered. Every detail mattered, every precaution was taken, and every action was calculated to ensure Liam's safety and the exposure of Grace's betrayal. Later that evening, when Liam's condition had stabilized slightly, Bill allowed himself a moment to breathe, to process the enormity of what had transpired. He thought about the conversations he would have to have with family members, the difficult explanations to make, the heartbreak to navigate. But he also thought about the justice that would be served, the lessons learned, and the unbreakable bond that would ultimately be reinforced between him and his son. Liam had survived, and that survival was a testament not only to the skill of the doctors but to the unwavering vigilance of a father who would not allow betrayal to harm his family. As the night deepened, Bill finally allowed himself a glance at Grace, who now sat quietly, her eyes downcast, the air of invincibility she had once projected completely shattered. He knew this confrontation was far from over. There would be legal battles, family confrontations, and perhaps even public exposure of her actions. But at this moment, all that mattered was Liam's immediate safety, the removal of the threat Grace posed, and the reclamation of control over a situation that had spiraled dangerously out of his hands. The hospital room, once suffused with tension and uncertainty, now held a quiet determination, a calm built on vigilance and action. Bill remained by Liam's side, eyes never leaving his son, heart heavy with the knowledge of what could have happened, but resolute in the understanding that the danger had been neutralized, that Grace's schemes had been exposed, and that his role as protector was absolute and non-negotiable. Outside the room, the world continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside, a storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, resolve, and the knowledge that the Spencer family, though tested, remained unbroken, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead with courage, strategy, and an unyielding love that would never waver. Even as the night stretched on and the hospital corridors fell into an uneasy quiet, Bill stayed rooted at Liam's bedside, his eyes scanning every flicker of the monitors, every subtle movement, every sign that his son might be slipping further into danger. Grace sat a few feet away, her posture slumped, the confidence she had carried like armor utterly gone, replaced by a brittle tension that made her glance toward Bill almost instinctively, hoping he might show mercy. But Bill was not the man to offer forgiveness lightly, certainly not after a betrayal this deep. Every instinct screamed at him, anger, rage, fear, but beneath it all a calculated, almost clinical focus drove his actions. He would not allow emotion alone to guide him. He would ensure that Liam's safety was absolute, that Grace's lies and schemes were documented, and that the consequences for her actions would be unavoidable and public if necessary. Bill leaned slightly toward Liam, gently brushing a hand across his son's hair, feeling the fragile warmth, the steady but weak pulse, the small rise and fall of his chest. The sight brought a pang to his chest, but also renewed determination. "I've got you, son," he whispered softly, his voice low enough that only Liam, or perhaps even just himself, could hear. "No one's going to hurt you again. Not her, not anyone. I promise you that." And while Liam remained unconscious, his body battered by Grace's treachery, Bill felt an almost tangible sense of connection, a silent promise being exchanged across the fragile distance of a hospital bed. Grace, sensing the intensity in his tone, attempted to shift, to interject, but Bill's sharp gaze cut her off. "Don't," he said flatly, a single word heavy with authority. "Your explanations are meaningless. Every move you made, every lie, every manipulation, it's all over now. You've done enough damage, and I won't allow it to continue. The doctors, the nurses, the administration, they all know. And soon everyone else will know too." Her shoulders slumped further, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap, the first real signs of fear beginning to take hold. For the first time, Grace realized that the careful, manipulative strategy she had relied upon would no longer protect her. The facade was gone, stripped away by the relentless focus of a father determined to safeguard his son. As Bill spoke quietly to the nurse, reviewing Liam's medications, discussing adjustments to his recovery plan, and ensuring that no further risks remained, he began thinking about the broader implications. This was more than a personal betrayal. It was a threat that could ripple across his family, across the hospital, and potentially into the public eye. He would need to prepare for questions, for confrontations, for the media, if Grace decided to go to the authorities or spin her story. Every detail mattered now. The timeline of her access to Liam, the medications administered, the subtle signs of decline that had been recorded in his charts. Everything would need to be documented, everything precise, because in situations like this proof was power, and Bill intended to hold all of it. And yet, amid the planning, amid the fury, there was a flicker of gratitude, almost fragile in its intensity, that Liam was still alive. The boy's resilience, the skill of the hospital's staff, and the swift action of Bill himself had prevented the worst. But the incident had left its mark. Trust had been broken, boundaries violated, and a dangerous precedent set. Bill knew he would never allow anyone, no matter how polite, clever, or seemingly trustworthy, to threaten his family like this again. Hours later, when the night had deepened into the early morning, Bill finally allowed himself to sit, exhaustion creeping into his body, though his mind remained sharp, focused. He glanced once more at Liam, sleeping fitfully, still recovering, still vulnerable but alive. And he looked at Grace, seated quietly under supervision, her every attempt at composure now replaced by anxiety and fear. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same. Liam's recovery would be carefully monitored, Grace's schemes would be fully exposed, and Bill would see to it that his family, and his son, were protected from anyone who dared threaten them again. This confrontation, though exhausting and emotionally brutal, had reaffirmed the unyielding truth Bill lived by. When it came to his family, he would stop at nothing, face any danger, and confront any betrayal, because some battles, especially those for the life and safety of your child, were absolute, and there could be no compromise.